Welcome everyone to the Haberman Institute and to our discussion with David Kertzer on the kidnapping of Edgaro Mortara, the continuing controversy. Thank you for joining us online this afternoon. I am George Johnson. I am a member of the Board of Directors of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and I am very pleased to introduce our program and to participate in our discussion this afternoon. The mission of the Haberman Institute is to provide high-quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture. Thank you very much, David, for your generous contribution of your time in helping us to achieve that objective. We invite all of you out there to visit our website, habermaninstitute.org, to learn more about our programs and courses for this fall. Our next Institute lecture is October 27th. Both sides now, legal disputes, constitutional freedoms, and American Jewish advocacy. Very timely discussion we'll have there. It's being, the speaker is Lauren Strauss, who is a former executive director of the Haberman Institute and currently is a scholar in residence and director of undergraduate studies in Jewish Studies program at American University. Today's speaker is Pulitzer Prize winning author David Kertzer. David is Paul Dupuy University Professor of Social Science at Brown University. He is a professor of anthropology and Italian studies. He served as provost of Brown University from 2006 until 2011. He has received many prestigious awards for his work, and I will just highlight some of his achievements. The kidnapping of Edgaro Mortara was a finalist for the National Book Award in 1997 and has been published in 18 foreign editions. A play based on the book by playwright Alfred Urey was performed at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis in 2006. In 2016, Steven Spielberg announced that he will be making a film based on the Kertzer book with a screenplay by Tony Kushner. His 2001 book, The Popes Against the Jews, has been published in 9 languages. And in 2015, David won the Pulitzer Prize for biography for his book, The Pope and Mussolini. His most recent book is The Pope Who Would Be King, about Pope Pius IX, who was the Pope at the time of the Mortara kidnapping and the fall of the Papal States. More recently, David has been in the news for his research into the newly opened Vatican archive of the papacy of Pope Pius XII. David will be talking about new revelations from that archive this afternoon. Our format today will be a discussion. As we go along, your questions are invited. Please write them in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. Our staff will moderate these questions. If practical, we will take them as we go along. Otherwise, we will address them toward the end of the program. The program is being recorded, and we will make our best efforts to make the recording available later this week. And before we begin, I'd just like to thank both Matt Silverman and Rebecca Levy. Matt's the executive director of the Institute, and Rebecca's the director of programs and communication for the Institute. And I want to thank them very much for all their efforts in putting this program together. So let's begin. David, what makes your book so fascinating is the way in which it has so many layers to it. There's the dramatic theater of the story of this family that's terrorized by the Vatican and lose their child. There's the background of oppression of the Jews and the repeated kidnappings. There's the anomaly of medieval rule in modern times. There's the international intrigue among the rival patron countries supporting the papacy. in the Papal States. There's the role of in the kidnapping, or the effect of the kidnapping on the Risorgimento, the national determination movement of the Italian people, the unification of Italy, and the overthrow of the Papal States. There's the mobilization of the worldwide Jewish community in defense of the Mortaras. And finally, there's the bizarre story of the church fabricating alternative facts about the kidnapping. So my question to you is, how did you first get interested in the story of the kidnapping of Edgaro Mortara? And could you give us a little bit of the story?
Right, so maybe we should begin for those who aren't familiar with the story, or perhaps once knew about it but forgot. This is a case from 1858, so it's really the dying days of the Papal States. Many people think of Italy as having been around for hundreds of years, but the Italian nation state was only created in around 1860, so not that old. And before that, the Italian peninsula was divided into various little mini states and principalities, but running through the middle, from Rome up to Bologna, was the Papal State, which for 1,000 years, the Pope served both as religious leader, but also as the king. He was known as the Pope King. And in 1858, the Inquisitor in Bologna, and one thing people seem often surprised by is that it still was an Inquisition in 1858. Tend to think of the Inquisition as something from hundreds of years ago. But there still was an Inquisition. The Inquisitor heard that a small child in a Jewish family had been secretly baptized by the illiterate teenage Christian servant girl of the family. And when he heard that, according to church policy, he, after checking with the Holy Office of the Inquisition in Rome, headed by the Pope himself, Pius IX, he got their authorization and then ordered the police to seize the child, who was then, Edgaro was then 6 years old, from his Jewish family, and take him to Rome and put him into a church institution established for converting the Jews. And there began the drama of the story of the family, which is really a two-part drama, the family drama trying to desperately get their 6-year-old child back, but also a larger drama of Italy, where the question of separation of church and state, taking away police powers from the Pope, was all part of this national unification movement that would lead to the creation of a unified Italy just a couple of years later. So that's, you know, in a nutshell, the story, or at least the beginning of the story. At the time, it was hugely controversial, and it was real international cause célèbre. In the US, in San Francisco, for example, 3,000 people came to a protest meeting, Return Edgaro. A couple thousand to a protest meeting in New York. The French emperor got involved, demanding that the Pope return the child to his family. Jewish community throughout the world began for the first time, in many cases, to organize self-help organizations. So, and not least, it would play a role, maybe we can talk about later, in the unification of Italy itself. So at the time, it was publicized in all the newspapers and so on, protest meetings. Yet it became forgotten, so that by the time I first heard about it, I had been actually working in Bologna, including on 19th century history in that area for a number of years, when a colleague mentioned this story to me and I was unfamiliar with it. And so one of the questions is, why was it forgotten? And that too, I think, just briefly has two parts. One, of course, from the church point of view, it's a bit embarrassing these days that this child was forcibly taken from his family and they refused to return him. But the other part of it is it's also been embarrassing for the Jewish community, especially in Italy, because that child would eventually not return to his family, but become a priest.
What, another thing that's so fascinating about the book is how it reads like a novel. It's filled with an enormous amount of details, and you are really there in the story. And there's so much riveting, dramatic detail. So the question comes to mind is, how did you do that? What is it based on?
Yeah, so I remember there was authors tend to only remember negative reviews. Luckily, most of the reviews of that book were quite positive, but there was one that I remember that was negative. I think it was maybe the Cleveland Plain Dealer or some other Midwestern paper. And the reviewer said, this is supposed to be a work of nonfiction, but clearly the author must have invented details to make it read more novelistically. And he gave us an example. He said that when the police came to take the child, the mother, Mariana, was sitting knitting socks or something. And in fact, she testified to that at later a trial of the Inquisitor for kidnapping her child. So yeah, this actually did represent something of a change for me. I'd written a number of books for your typical university press books for largely scholarly colleagues. And I decided when I first heard about this story, maybe this was a desire or ambition I had for a long time. I thought I didn't want to just write books anymore for a few hundred colleagues. I'd like to interest a larger public in Italian history, and in this case, a part of Jewish history as well. And so the big advantage I had in this particular case is there would be a major legal case fought over it. One thing you find is, particularly in dealing with lesser, more obscure people, like the Mortara family, rather than kings and queens and so on, or popes, is that if their lives enter the court system, and you as a lawyer might appreciate this, it creates an incredible wealth of documentation about their lives because of all the testimonies involved. That gives you a kind of insight you wouldn't have any other way. So the Inquisitor later on is tried for kidnapping the child. This leads to, and it was my discovery of the 700 pages of transcripts of the testimony for that trial that led me to think I could write a book like this. And of course, there were many other archival sources, especially the Vatican archives, that I used as well.
So where did you find all this material? You mentioned the Vatican archives. Was that the principal source?
Well, the trial of the Inquisitor, because that was the new Italian state, when they took over in Bologna, the first person practically the police went to arrest was, this is in January 1860, so about 18 months or so after the child was taken. But in the meantime, Bologna has been overthrown. The papal power in Bologna has been overthrown. The new Italian state is taking over. They go and arrest the Inquisitor charge him with kidnapping this child, who's still not been returned to his family. It's in Rome. And so this begins the trial. That trial transcript, the 700 pages I mentioned, are in the state archives, not in Vatican archives. There's state archives in Bologna. In the Vatican archives, there are also hundreds of pages of documents because this became a crisis for the Vatican. They became under huge pressure to release the child, yet the Pope Pius IX decided he could not release the child. It would go against his basic religious principles. And so we have, for example, the French nuncio coming to speak with the Vatican Secretary of State, telling him the dire consequences that will befall the Pope if they don't release the child. All that kind of documentation would be in the Vatican archives.
So you mentioned the Inquisitor, and earlier you mentioned that the people may wonder that the Inquisition was still current. How specifically did the Inquisition and the Inquisitor impact the Mortara events, and how did it interface with the civil authorities? For example, the police that arrested.
Of course, in the big dividing line is the fall of the Papal States, because under the Papal States, the Pope and the Church was the civil authority. There was no distinction. There was no separation of church and state. So in fact, it was the Inquisitor himself who ordered the police, the regular police in the Papal States in Bologna, to go to the home and seize the child from his family. The Inquisition, the Holy Office of the Inquisition, had been created in the 16th century, initially in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, to fight against the heresy. And it was primarily devoted to rooting out Christian heresy among Christians. but it had a kind of secondary role in cases like this because from the church point of view, once Edgardo had been baptized, he was Christian. He wasn't Jewish. This was the problem, that from a church point of view, once a child is baptized, that child should not be allowed to be raised by a Jewish family because he or she would undoubtedly lapse into the mortal sin of apostasy.
So I mentioned in the introduction that there was this set of alternative facts that were created. And you, of course, go through that in your book. Who is responsible for creating those alternative stories? The idea, for example, that on the trip when Edgardo was being ferried to Rome, he insisted that the people in the car stopped so he could visit churches.
Right, the carriage, yes. Well, because this became such a sensitive political issue, the movement to put an end to the Pope's rule over the Papal States and unify Italy in a secular state, modern secular state with separation of church and state, this case played into those concerns and those polemics, so that there became a battle between, on the one hand, both the Jewish and the, you might say, liberal press, and on the other, the church press, which created two totally different narratives of what had happened. So from the liberal press and the Jewish press, they told of this child who had been literally taken by violence from his father's arms and crying, screaming to be returned to his family, is taken down to Rome. Then when his parents get to a few months later visit with him, begging them to take him back to his brothers and sisters and to his family. That was all in the Jewish press and the liberal press. The Catholic press, including Civiltà Cattolica, which is the Vatican overseen Jesuit journal published in Rome still today, came out with the story that no sooner had he been freed from the kind of grip of his Judaic parents, the miraculous effects of baptism could fully take their effect. And so even, as you mentioned, as he's on the way to Rome from his, having been taken from his parents, he is asking to stop along the way at every church he sees so he could go inside and admire the portraits of the Madonna and so forth and pray. And that no sooner does he get to the church institution for the conversion of Jews, the House of the Catechumens, then he's delighted to be there. So these were the competing narratives.
Well, at some point, the alternative facts became the facts, in a sense. At some point, the child being in this institution for the conversion of Jews and Muslims in Rome seemed to become Christian. When could you tell us a little about when you think that happened and which events? That's not directly covered in your book. I don't remember it. Do you have any idea when it happened?
Well, I tried in the book, you talk about writing for a broader audience. And I think one of the things that makes for good drama, but also good history, is the ambiguity of history. And one of the ambiguous things is we know that he becomes a priest, he becomes a monk. So at some point, certainly, his identity changes, his loyalties change, his theology, insofar as a 6-year-old can have one, changes. But when did that happen? And people talk about brainwashing and so forth. Clearly, it's happened within several months. It doesn't take many years. It's several months, but it is probably several months. Exactly how long this is, we don't know. I suspect that after 6 months, let's say, in the church institutions and away from his family, and he's been taught that the Jews go to hell and suffer eternal torment. The Jews are cursed by God for having murdered the Lord and so forth. So it's in this, and he's 6 years old. Not just that, but he soon the Pope begins to regard himself as something of the surrogate father. He goes and visits the Pope and all the splendor. So from his kind of modest home with sharing an apartment with a whole bunch of siblings, to see the beauty and opulence of the Vatican and the Pope treating him as his surrogate father, all this must have had some impact on his attitude.
Right. It seems to be implied in some of the encounters that you discuss in the book that it didn't take that long where he was apprehensive about meeting his parents. That seems to be the case.
Yes, I mean, this is, by the way, one of the difficulties of writing a screenplay. You mentioned Tony Kushner has written a screenplay for a film version of my book, and things where you can leave this kind of two different narratives, ambiguity in a book of this sort. If you're actually doing a film, that's, unless you want to do some kind of postmodern film, you kind of have to make a decision. When does he change his mind?
Right. So another question that comes to mind, which you do deal with in the book quite well, is what made this case different? I mean, Mortaro's kidnapping was not the first time that the Papal Inquisition had taken a Jewish child from its family based on a surreptitious baptism by a Catholic. But as you mentioned in the book, it had never generated attention or as politically significant as the Mortara kidnapping. And could you explain what made it different?
Yes, I mean, you're right. In fact, I wrote another book called The Popes Against the Jews, in which I have a chapter about these kind of cases, which were not uncommon. What was uncommon, as you mentioned, is that it becomes a matter of worldwide protest. So for centuries, this has been the position of the church that if a Jewish child was baptized, even against the wishes of the parents, the child could not be allowed to remain in the Jewish community or with Jewish family, and so it had to be taken away from them. And this had been done regularly throughout the Papal States, where the Pope had police power, certainly, but some other areas as well, where the church was and state were very close. And the Jewish community in fact, did complain, but no one else seemed really to care. No one else paid attention. But now things were changing. This is 1858. The Jews were increasingly given equal rights in other countries in Europe. They had a Jewish press, and importantly, in 1848, the Jewish community of Piedmont, the Kingdom of Savoy, which would ultimately be the kernel that unifies Italy, the Jews are liberated there. So they begin to have their own press and their own kind of political influence. So that's part of it, is the Jews are now in a much stronger position to make their voices heard. But the other is that this was like manna from heaven for the people like Count Cavour, the prime minister of the Savoyard state, and others who were looking to end the Papal States and bring about the unification of Italy, because it seemed to so well illustrate the dangers of the religious institutions also having police powers. For all these reasons, this case became an international scandal.
So you did touch on it in your last statements. But how important do you think the Mortara case was in bringing down the Papal State?
Yeah, it's not as if, if you're in Italy and you, of course, as part of your school education, have to learn about the Risorgimento, the unification of Italy, that you learn anything about the Mortara case. In fact, my book, when it came out, which also came out in Italy, it was the first book ever really on the Mortara case. The only book that had come out previously was a book in the US about the American reaction to the Mortara case, but which was quite interesting, but it was all about essentially the Jewish press and how they covered the case. And it was written by someone who didn't read Italian, so it was obviously limited in scope. But I would say it did have an impact, and especially, and this gets us to a detail of Italian unification, but Rome is protected by French troops. There had been a revolution of Rome in 1848. That was the subject of my recent book. Pope is driven out of Rome. He calls on the Catholic powers of Europe to send their armies to restore him the power. They do the following year. he comes back, but now the natives are restless. They're not happy with continued clerical rule, or what they call priestly rule. And so it's the French troops who are stationed in Rome who are protecting him. Yet the French emperor, Napoleon III, is irate when he hears about the Mortara case, because it just illustrates for him how, as from his point of view, retrograde the Papal States are. And so the threat, he really has a real purchase there, and eventually he will pull his troops out of Rome, and that's in a way the occasion for Rome becoming part of the Italian state.
So the French were, they were Catholic, right? They had a large Catholic population, but they had a foot in both camps, didn't they? They were both Republicans, equal rights people, and also Catholic. They kind of, and they were supporting the Pope. They were the ones that brought the Pope back, and yet their withdrawal really was key.
Well, France long had a tradition of two different camps: the kind of conservative Catholic camp and the secular, more might call liberal camp. And these had been kind of fighting for a couple of centuries. At the time, and the Napoleon himself, Louis Napoleon, was a good example of this. As a youth, he had actually spent time in Rome as a youth and had been very anti-clerical then and opposed to the Papal States. Later on, he saw it in his interest to appeal to the conservative Catholics in France, and so he was the one who ordered the French troops to retake Rome for the Pope in 1849.
So the Risorgimento succeeds, the Papal States fall, and there was the trial of the Inquisitor, Father Filetti. But did things change much for the Jews of Italy at that time? Was that, a big threshold, and things were different after that?
Well, yeah, it was, especially in the Papal States. In the Papal States, the Jews had been for centuries confined to a ghetto, limited in the occupations they could have and the schooling they could get and so on. So now all of a sudden they are equal citizens. So this is dramatic change for the Jews in the Papal States, which again extends from Rome up through Bologna, includes Ferrara and a number of other cities. Again, Italy was a kind of a patchwork of different states. So the impact on the Jews was less so in Turin because, as I mentioned, 1848, they had been liberated. All of southern Italy had very few Jews, and this is interesting from a historical point of view because back in the medieval period, the largest concentration of Jews in Italy was in Sicily, where there were tens of thousands. But as a result of the Spanish rule over southern Italy, and the Spanish influence over southern Italy, the Spanish Inquisition, which famously led to the kicking out the Jews in 1492 there, led in the 16th century to the expulsion of the Jews in southern Italy as well. So at the time of Italianification, there were very few Jews living south of Rome, and that, of course, also would change.
So the Mortaras never get their son back. He goes up to become a priest.
So we have a question.
Can I jump in before the next question? There's a lot of questions that have come in with seeking some clarity about the background of the family and maybe in the circumstances of his baptism and sort of why the Pope, it's kind of a three-part question here, and why the Pope was adamant in not returning the child. You have any additional thoughts on some of that history?
Yes. Well, just very briefly, what had happened was the family, it was a middle-class family. It was a small merchant of curtains and this sort of thing in Bologna. They had a Christian servant girl or domestic assistant who lived there. She had years earlier, this is actually when Edgaro was just 12 months old. He's six years at the time he's taken in 1858, but when he was 12 months old, he had been sick. And what she later would claim is that seeing that he was sick and having heard what happened to Jews who died not having been baptized, remaining Jews, she sprinkled water over him when no one was looking and recited the baptismal formula, which is just one sentence. It's very simple. But then he got better and she didn't let anyone know until, and then there are various versions of the story of how the Inquisitor came to hear, but basically it seems that she told a friend and the friend told her parish priest, and the parish priest reported it to the inquisitor. He then reports it to the office of the Inquisition in Rome, and the rest is what takes place. Now, why the Pope didn't return him is because, and this is something that really didn't change until quite recently. In fact, I had a recent piece that appeared just a few weeks ago in the Atlantic about some new discovery made about post-World War II, where the same thing happens, that the official doctrine of the church is that, as I referred to earlier, a Jewish child who's baptized is, you might say, supernaturally transformed and is Christian and cannot be returned to a Jewish family, because then the child would, of course, return to their Jewish identity despite having been baptized, and this could not be allowed.
Okay. So I think I'd go on and ask you to describe the later encounters, the interactions between the neophyte, or to become a priest, Edgaro Mortara, and his family, if you would.
Yeah. So this gets us back to a little bit of Italian history. So 1858 is when he's taken. Just a year later, he's taken in June 1858. In June 1859, the Bologna rises up and overthrows papal powers there. Over the next year, this happens throughout much of Italy. And in a year later, by 1860, 1861, Italy is unified. The Kingdom of Italy is proclaimed, but the area around Rome remains protected by those French troops and remains in papal hands. So we're now going to enter a period of 10 years until Rome is finally taken in 1870, where he has been placed in a religious institution, a seminary in Rome, Edgaro has, and although his parents got to visit him a few times just within months of his having been taken, now they don't see him again. And he is, meanwhile, his father is going around Europe trying to whip up international pressure on the Vatican to release him and send him back home, but all to no avail. That first image you had there was showed him as a young seminarian, as a child, 1867, at the feet of Pius IX. And then the next image that we have there shows him as an adult. So in 1870, the Rome falls, the last vestige of the Papal States fall. The Italian troops seize Rome from the Pope. And the father, Edgaro's father, Momolo, goes to reclaim him. But now he's 19 years old. He spent the last dozen years in religious institutions, and he's decided he wants to become a priest or a monk. And so he flees. And he flees initially to Austrian territory, then France. He gets a further education to become a monk. And so the next time the family actually gets to see him is sort of shown in this next image, I think, where his mother hears that he's giving a sermon in France and goes to meet him. And that image, if we could see the next image there, shows him as now this is later, but this is a curious picture because I have it here because he's now 54 years old in this picture, and what's he holding? He's holding a picture of his mother. That's a picture of his mother. Of course, it died quite a few years before this. So curiously, although he would devote his life to, among other things, proselytizing among Jews to get them to see the light the way he did and become Christian like him, he retained affection for his family and really felt the lack of family and tried to keep in touch with them. So whenever he would come back into Italy, because he roamed Europe and even spent several months in the United States, that's a whole other story, he would occasionally come back.
Can we show the opening picture? I think that shows a picture of that you might want to just mention at this point.
Right. So if we, in that opening collage we had, the opening shot, there's also a picture of his encounter with his mother and his brother, Riccardo. neither of whom were all that happy with his life decision to become a priest. And as I mentioned earlier, it's also somewhat embarrassing for the Jewish community that he had been held up as this kind of heroic child figure, but then once he becomes a priest, he's no longer quite so heroic from the Jewish community's point of view. And so this is a picture of his mother, and you see the young priest there, and that's his brother Ricardo, looking not too happy himself. Ricardo had actually joined the Italian army and was with the Italian army when it liberated Rome from the Pope in 1870. So they were on two opposite sides of that conflict.
Okay, let's move on chronologically to the adult life of Edgardo and his role as an itinerant preacher, as you alluded to. And I was wondering whether you could describe some of what happened when he visited the United States. I think that's particularly interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think it's 1893, he decides to go to the United States and to continue his work proselytizing, but he thought he would proselytize particularly among the Italian-American immigrant population. You have to realize, we think back to New York in 1890s, they were in the midst of a very large migration from Italy, but also a very large Jewish migration mainly from Eastern Europe. And he goes to see the Archbishop of New York in Manhattan. He's been sponsored by a group of monks in Brooklyn. He's staying in Brooklyn. He goes to get the support of the Archbishop so that he can set up his mission to Italian Americans in New York City. And the Archbishop is basically horrified by his appearance. And he writes to the Vatican, where I found in the archives there the letter that he writes. He writes the letter because he's worried. Why is he worried? Because he knows that Edgardo has many supporters in the church in New York, and he's afraid they're going to badmouth what he's done, which is to turn down Edgardo's request to be able to proselytize in New York. What the Archbishop writes to the Vatican is that, here we have this large Italian immigrant population, but we also have a large Jewish immigrant population, and they get along for the most part, the communities quite well. The last thing we need is to have this person there who would remind the Jewish community of this very painful episode with the church. So please keep him as far away as possible.
And what about there was a letter that he wrote to somebody in Louisville.
Right. Yes, that was also something I found, although I found in a Brooklyn archive. It turned out that at the same time he was visiting the United States, a new big history of the Jews came out, or at least the volume dealing with the Mortara case. And it had said that he came to curse his parents because he wanted them to convert, and therefore the family could be unified, because this is what how the Vatican responded to the family when they said they wanted their child back. They said, well, no problem, as long as you, the parents, and the rest of your children accept baptism, there's nothing to prevent you from being unified. So this history of the Jews said he came to resent his family and to kind of spit on the memory of his parents and so forth. I may be overstating it a little bit. So this Jewish person from Louisville, Kentucky, wrote him a letter reading that he had come to Brooklyn. And we have a copy of this letter in his own hand, written in English, of course. He was talented. He was more or less fluent in 7 languages, including Basque language, which is not that easy, and preached in all of them. So he wrote back and he said, this is untrue, that in fact, I always revered my parents. I obeyed the commandment that one should honor one's parents. And although I tried to get my parents to convert, they didn't, but I still respected them. So this is the kind of tightrope he walked.
So let's switch gears a little bit and fast forward to the publication of your book. And as I recall, in one of your articles, you mentioned that the early reception to the book was from Catholic press or reviewers was not that bad, was not that antagonistic. But somewhere along the line, things changed, and they seem to have accelerated. They accelerated negative writings and also interest in your book.
Yes.
And I was wondering whether you could just go over that history with us, including, you know, covering what happened with the Mortara autobiography and the translation and the controversy about that.
Okay. All right. Well, there's a lot there. Yes, just 6 weeks ago, the Vatican daily newspaper devoted a full page to denouncing me in my recent work. So it's been somewhat rocky reception. But you're right. When the Mortara book came out, actually the review, I talked about the one negative review I remember, and I don't remember positive reviews. Actually, I do remember one positive review specific, and that
That's
was
the one you must have
same
mentioned.
newspaper, the same newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, the daily newspaper of the Vatican. I had a very positive review of the book on Edgaro Mortara, and it said that I tried to present fairly how both sides saw this. In other words, and as I mentioned before, good history, just like good drama, I think isn't here the good guys, here are the bad guys, the white hats, the bad hats, that life is more complicated. And I tried to portray the Pope not as a nefarious character, terrible anti-Semite, or talking that kind of language, but really understand his worldview, his mentality, and why he thought he was saving the soul of this child. In fact, he was said to have told Edgaro, you have cost me, dear Edgaro, you've cost me dearly, you've cost me my kingdom. But I then published subsequently a book called The Popes Against the Jews. Subtitle is something like The Role of the Vatican in the Rise of Modern Anti-Semitism. And because what that would have been prompted by a statement in 1998, I think it was, called We Remember. Pope at the time, John Paul II, had called on a commission headed by a cardinal to look into the charge that the church bore some responsibility for the anti-Semitism that made the Holocaust possible. And that commission report ended up concluding that, no, that's not true. There were actually two different things. There was traditional, what they called anti-Judaism of the church, but that had nothing to do with modern anti-Semitism, which is what led to the Holocaust, which was social, political, economic, and racial. And from working in the Vatican archives, I knew this was totally untrue. And so that led to this book. That book, which in fact showed, I think, demonstrated why the official Vatican position about responsibility for the Holocaust was erroneous, was not appreciated in some quarters anyway of the Vatican. And one thing we should, of course, be careful about is not only when you talk about the church, it's very heterogeneous and there are people of all sorts of persuasions here, but even the Vatican, there are different perspectives one finds in the Vatican. But in that case, the journal I mentioned earlier that's overseen by the Vatican, the Jesuit journal Civiltà Cattolica, ran a 20-page lead article denouncing me in that book. So unfortunately, I think the Vatican has had difficulty coming to terms with this history, and so my work has not been pleasing to everybody.
How about what happened with the First Things article, the review that was written of the translation by Missouri, that was supposedly a translation of the Spanish language autobiography of Mortara in 1880. That itself seems to have fueled a fairly strong academic kind of controversy of sorts. Could you describe what that's about?
Right, so again, it's a little bit curious that a case of forced baptism in mid-19th century would become a hot issue, theological issue, and maybe political issue these days. But a conservative but well-known in Italy, Catholic journalist named Vittorio Messori, published what he said was the basically autobiography that Edgardo Mortara had written as a young man when he was still in his 30s. He said he found it in an archive of his order. He was a member of Edgardo became a member of the Order of the Canons Regular. And at the archives of the Church of the Canons Regular in Rome, he found a copy of this. As you mentioned, he had written in Spanish when he was living in Spain, preaching there. And it was published initially in Italian, his Italian translation of the Spanish. And then more recently in, I think came out, well, 2017, 2018, one of the more prominent Catholic presses in the United States, Ignatius Press, published an English translation. And so this was presented as as you see there, and this is from the catalog copy that when it was first being published, the press put out. And it's interesting to me because I found, well, for various reasons, but we went to the same archive. I found the same copy he had. I digitized it. And I looked at what he had published, first of all, when his Italian version came out, and saw that he had heavily doctored it. So there are actually two problems. And so now it's being presented as was presented by Ignatius Press. And then she mentioned First Things, that conservative but influential Catholic monthly, published a review of that English edition of Edgardo Mortara's memoir. And the review, it's interesting to note, was by him, a member of the cloth himself, a member of the Roman clergy, who's not only is a member of the clergy, but is the professor of theology at the seminary in Boston for training of priests, the New England Seminary for training of priests in Boston. And he used it to write this piece defending Pius IX and his decision to keep Edgardo away from his parents, that he was obeying a higher good, namely his own Christian beliefs about the power of baptism and the danger of a baptized child returning to his Jewish religion. So one thing I found out, there are kind of two issues, and I wrote up a piece for The Atlantic about this a couple of years ago. First of all, he doctored the memoir, and he would add whole paragraphs that weren't in the original. He would take out various anti-Semitic things that Edgardo had to say. So it was changed. The second thing to note about it is, even if you translated it faithfully, it would not have told you a true story. It was a story he had come up with, and as part of his shtick, as he went around preaching his inspirational story to encourage other people to follow his example. And in fact, that passage I have, what they decided to feature on the catalog copy of Ignatius Press in announcing the book, was totally false. It said that when the Pope learned that, and the inquisitors learned that he'd been baptized, the inquisitor came multiple times to approach the family, you see the quote there, and essentially, beg the parents to allow him to go to a local boarding school where he'd still, regularly see his family and so forth. And after several failed attempts to persuade them, it was only then that reluctantly the Pope ordered the boy taken. Oh, this is totally false. This never happened. The parents knew nothing about this until the police showed up to seize him from his parents that evening in June. So, this is, now I don't know whether Ignatius Press, I was going to check, but I haven't, have they withdrawn the book? They should, but I'd be a little surprised if they had.
Yeah, I remember seeing you talk at the Association for Jewish Studies conference a few years ago, in which there was a kind of a debate about it, and so it was a real controversy then, and that was what struck me, is that it's still being debated.
Well, and the controversy, again, it was also within the Catholic world that after this First Things piece, even the New York Times columnist Ross Douthat and others tweeted about this, and an archbishop wrote a criticism of this review, saying, we shouldn't be defending the taking of a Jewish child from his family in this way, and in the 21st century. But so even in the Catholic world, it occasioned quite a debate.
Speaking of the 21st century, let's switch gears again and start a little bit into your recent trip to the archives of Pope Pius XII, which opened, I believe it was March 2nd, and you were there for that event.
Yes, here's a picture of me there.
Could you describe that picture a little bit? And
yeah, so there had been pressure on the Vatican to open its archives, especially for World War II, for many years. And we can talk about that, why that is and that controversy. So Pope Francis announced in March of 2019 that a year hence they would open the archives for the papacy of the controversial wartime Pope Pius XII. And it ultimately opened on March 2nd. So I was there. Here, this is a picture of me. So on the left, you see the cortile, the courtyard where we're facing actually the Vatican, what used to be called the Vatican Secret Archives. They recently renamed it, Pope renamed it just a little over a year ago. So it's no longer called the Vatican Secret Archives, but the Vatican Apostolic Archive. And then kind of a close-up of that door you see on the left and in the middle of the picture. We're standing there, and I'm standing Hubert Wolff, and this also gets at the question of the heterogeneity in the church and the heterogeneity of the church in dealing with these kind of delicate matters of history. Hubert Wolff is a priest, but he's also a professor of history in Germany, and perhaps the leading European historian of this history of the fascist period, the Nazi period, and the role of the Vatican and of the church. Unlike me, he gets to bring a whole kind of a whole group of researchers with him, and so I'm standing there next to Professor Wolff, and then not even all of the people he brought with him to work. And this is just a few minutes before that morning, March 2nd, they would open those archives for the first time as we're about to go in that door.
So, okay, so as people who have read your article in The Atlantic are aware, you found quite a few things there that are really eye-opening. And so there are several questions. Maybe some basic questions first. Maybe what is the archive itself? Could you describe what is the archive and what's there? And I understand there's more than one archive.
Yeah, so when we talk about the opening of the Vatican archives for World War II and for the papacy of Pius XII actually goes from 1839, just before the war begins, to 19, get into the 20th century, 1939 to 1958. So it's almost 2 decades of history, and there are tens of millions of pieces of paper in these archives that have been opened. So you saw the picture of the door to the largest archive, the Apostolic Archive, but there are a number of other archives that became open at the same time. And from my point of view, the 2 most important that in the Vatican that became open that I began working in, along with that, was the archive of the Secretariat of State of the Vatican and the archive of the Holy Office of what had been known as the Inquisition, but beginning in the early 20th century, it was just known as the Holy Office, and now it's known as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So I worked in all 3 of those, and as you mentioned, the Atlantic article, one of the things, although I was focusing, I'm writing a book on the relationship of Pius XII to the war and to Mussolini and Hitler during the war, so therefore 39 to 45. But I came across a series of thick files on what had become one of the most controversial cases of Jewish-Christian relations after the war, the case of the kidnapping of the Finelli brothers in France. And so that led to this article. And what's curious is how similar it is to the Mortara case. It's another case of the baptism of small Jewish children against the wishes of their parents. But in this case, there was the additional drama that this had to do with the Holocaust, that the Holocaust led to thousands of orphans of parents who had been taken to the death camps and who were saved in various Catholic institutions and Catholic families. And it was thought right after the war that there were thousands of these children in Poland and the Netherlands, in other countries with Catholic populations, like France, that were not being returned to their families insofar as they had relatives who had survived the war. And the Finley case is the most notable of this. The children here you see them after they are reunited with their aunt. But these two boys' parents, when they were just 1 and 2 years old in 1944, were taken by the Gestapo from southeastern France, sent to their death at Auschwitz. They were protected by a Catholic woman who, after the war, when even in 1945, before the war was even over, but France had been liberated, the family asked to have the children returned to the sisters of the father who he wanted to leave them with if anything happened to him, and she refused to give them up. And that led to 8 years till the family would finally be able to reclaim the children, who were being hidden in the meantime in an underground network of monasteries and convents, ultimately taken to a monastery across the border into Spain to hide them because the French courts had been ordering the return to the family. What I discovered in the newly opened archives was this trove of documents detailing the involvement of the Pope and the Holy Office in determining what action should be taken by the church in France and ultimately in Spain about the return or not return of the children.
Amazing, isn't it? So have you had any discussions with any church leaders or representatives of the Vatican about this idea that this still is part of the church canon?
Well, it's interesting, you know, what's part of the church canon, what isn't. I mean, what is still part of the church canon, in fact, it gets cited by that First Things article by the professor of theology I mentioned a couple of years ago. He says, still today, the canon law says that if a Catholic sees a Jewish child in danger of dying, even against the will of parents, the right thing to do is to baptize him or her. That's still in the canon law today, which I had to double check before I published this recent piece in the Atlantic. I checked with a canon lawyer, but it's also, you can find it online, which I referenced in the Atlantic piece. So the difference, of course, with the Mortara case is the church, of course, nowhere has police powers, so they're not in a position to enforce it in the same way that they were in the Mortara case. That said, in 1945, for 8 years, the network of church monasteries and institutions was able to keep those children from their parents. Now, the Vatican, the church position toward the Jews radically changed with the Second Vatican Council, and I think it's important to say that. And the 1965 Nostra Aetate statement, which abandoned the many centuries long vilification and demonization of the Jews and called for mutual respect. So, you know, we are talking about a very different situation in recent decades.
And so we don't know whether it's a dead letter or not.
Yes, well, I think the danger of having, if you're a Jewish family, of having your child secretly baptized and taken away from you is probably nothing to worry about these days.
Okay. Well, there's this other part of your article in the Atlantic, and the other bombshell that you revealed there. Would you like to talk about that? That has to do with the Pope and his role with regard to both the Roman Jewish community and the what he could have done with regard to the Catholic community in Germany, and so on.
Well, maybe we can put up the slide that I think we have, which gets us to the controversy about the silence of the Pope during the Holocaust. Okay. As I mentioned, there'd been pressure for 50 years to open the wartime archives, and that really, what had triggered that was in 1963, this play, The Deputy, by Ralph Hachuth, which charged the Pope with remaining silent during the Holocaust, never publicly speaking out, even though he was well aware of what was happening with the mass murder of Europe's Jews. And so with the opening of the archives, you know, there's been huge interest in what new light might be might be shed on this controversy. And in my Atlantic piece, although it was a bit of an aside, because the Finley case, one of the main Secretary of State of the Vatican people involved in advising the Pope on what to do was a Monsignor Angelo Dell'Acqua. I found that he had also played an important role, that he was a kind of go-to person for Pius XII in his dealings with the Jews and advising him. And he gave his memo, which I found from 2 months after the 1,000 Jews were taken from Rome and sent to their death at Auschwitz, advising the Pope to remain silent. That this was really kind of shocking, I think, to me, and was part of a series of memos 2 months after the taking of the Jews that led, or certainly had some significant influence in the decision of the church and of the Pope not to protest publicly what was going on. So just to remind people here that in October, the Germans, Mussolini was overthrown in late July of 43. The month or 6 weeks later, Italy announces that they are surrendering to the Allies, and the Germans flood into Italy and then take over Rome in early September. A month later, the SS tries to round up all the Jews they can find in Rome and spend several hours rounding up over 1,000 people, puts them in a kind of holding place, a military installation that's literally a stone's throw from the Pope in the Vatican, where they're kept for a couple of days before they're put on a train and sent to Auschwitz, and where all but a handful are murdered. So the question is, why did the Pope not protest? All the more so because popes for centuries, even while they were keeping the Jews in ghettos, portrayed themselves as the protectors of Rome's Jews. And we've had only limited information on that, although we have had some, but what I discovered was that in December, one of the main advisors of the Pope did advise him to protest, albeit privately, with the German ambassador to the Holy See. And he wrote a memo advising the Pope why he should protest. That memo, which I also published a translation in the Atlantic piece, was filled with anti-Semitic language. And basically its argument was that, look, we put in the fascist regime, thank goodness, put in 1938 the racial laws, which stripped the Jews of their rights and their ability to have any negative influence on Italy. So why do you now have to go and cart them off to their death? That seems a bit excessive. I'm putting, perhaps not stating this exactly as it's found, but if anybody's interested, the text is in the appendix to my Atlantic article, which is available online. But this other advisor to the Pope, Monsignor Dell'Acqua, who later would become Cardinal Vicar of Rome, says, no, why should we be protesting about the Jews, and saying that this is terrible when we haven't protested over other things like the Nazi invasion of Poland and so forth, but also was filled with various negative references to the Jews, saying, and we should tell the Jews to stop complaining so much. This 2 months after the 1,000 had been taken off to their death. And the other thing that's not realized is another 1,000 Jews would be found by the Nazis in Rome with the help of local Italians, of course, over the next several months of their occupation and taken to their death as well. So it wasn't just the 1,000 at the time of October. So this is the material that I've come across and got presented in part in that recent Atlantic article.
So going forward, you mentioned that you have a book planned. It sounds like it's going to rely in part on what you find in the archives. Do you have any particular plan for future return to the archive, and what are you looking for?
Well, luckily I collaborate with a historian excellent historian Roberto Benedetti, who is Roman and who is at the same time as we Americans have been kept out by COVID from Italy, has been able to continue to work there, and we continue to collaborate. And so I have, already a pretty huge number of documents from these newly opened archives copied. So my hope is to, and I've been working on this book on the relationship of the Pope to Mussolini, especially the Italian fascist regime during the war, but also is influenced by his relationship with Germany and Hitler. So my hope is to complete that book in the next year or so and hopefully be out within a couple of years.
Very good. Well, at this point, I want to thank you very much for our discussion. And we have a number of questions from our participants online. And I'm going to turn this over to Matt to give you some of the questions that he's curated. Thank you.
Thank you. So there's a number of questions about the baptism of children. And so start with one of them here. How common a practice was this kind of behavior of secretly baptizing Jewish children and then kidnapping them for the church? Or how many others might you guess suffered a similar fate? I guess this question goes along with another one. Maybe the 1800s was different than post-Holocaust, but also another question posed is post-Holocaust. Do you think this was a similar practice?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a big dividing line with the fall of the Papal States that once the Pope and the Church loses police power, this is much, a case exactly like the Edgaro Mortara case can't really happen where, the actual police are involved in taking the child from the Jewish parents and keeping him from the Jewish family. In the past, it had been common. It's not that it happened every day, but it happened often enough, for example, in the ghetto in Rome, that it was a constant worry of Jewish families. I mean, how often would it have to happen for you to be worried about it? But something like it seemed to happen every few years. So it's not every few days, but every few years there'd be a case like this, and had been for hundreds of years. So the Jews, not just in Rome, but certainly other parts of the Papal States, which I'm most familiar with that history, places like Ferrara and Bologna and so on. This was a fear that they were living with constantly. After World War II, this question of the Holocaust orphans, this was a big issue for the Jewish community after the war. The chief rabbi of then Palestine, Rabbi Herzog, immediately after the war in 1946, made a tour through parts of Europe specifically in order to help identify where Jewish orphans of the Holocaust were to be found and to be reclaimed by their families or by the Jewish community. He met with the Pope. He told the Pope, each of these children is like 1,000 children for you, because I forget the number he gave, but something like 1.25 million Jewish children had been murdered in the Holocaust. And so finding these children for the Jewish community, not just for their families, was so terribly important. And he called on the Pope to kind of issue a general call to the Catholics of Europe and the clergy to help identify these children, something the Pope declined to do. So this is also what we're finding in the archives. But how many there were, we don't know. They thought there were thousands, but of course there's no real census of this. And we still hear tales all the time, I'm sure you all do, of people who just found out that their grandparent was Jewish or their parent was Jewish and didn't even know it. And so this is a kind of a buried history. But there are other buried histories. I mean, we're going to talk about Italy in World War II. This gets a little bit at the earlier question about why the Mortara case got forgotten and it became embarrassing for the Jews, not just for Catholics. So there are embarrassing things for the Jewish community as well about World War II in Italy. And one of them is huge number of Jews converted, because the distinction between being carted off to your death and not is, did the church have credentials for you that you were a Christian, not a Jew? And so thousands of Jews in Italy's tiny Jewish community, beginning with the racial laws in 1938, were baptized. And we don't have any good history of that, or even good numbers. We know it was thousands, though.
Thank you. Actually, I have a couple of questions here. Both of a couple of the same questions. Both of these stories have been young males. Are gender girls often, or is it more boys in your experience?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. In the past, there was no distinction. So yeah, if anyone were to go to my Popes Against the Jews book, where I talk about some other cases, there are also a number of well-known cases of girls and also women, because another place that gender comes in is where you had cases, now talking during the Papal States, so not after 1870, but where a male would come and to the house of the catechumens and say, I want to be baptized and become Christian. If he had a wife, or even if he had a fiance, she would then be forcibly brought in by the police. So let's say, and you have many of these cases that for whatever reason, mainly because perhaps the person's impoverished and sees this as his way to a better life, maybe he's gotten in trouble in the ghetto, who knows, wants to be baptized, then his wife or fiance and small children are forcibly brought in. The small children are baptized, and the wife would be told, if you want to see your children again, you too need to be baptized. But she, as an adult, is free after 40 days there of attempted indoctrination, is free to return to her home in the ghetto, but not her children are not. So there's if anybody's interested in the gender aspect of this history, there's some interesting history to write here.
And then as far as just in this narrative or in other narratives, was the baptism itself ever put into question? Was it argued that it never happened? Like is that part of the narrative?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because I seem to be the only one who casts question on this. If you read any of the literature, it's all just assumed that there was a baptism. I'm not 100% sure, and this is one of the ambiguities I sort of leave in my book. It turns out that there was a special dowry. Why was this young illiterate girl or woman working in Bologna? Well, she was part of a general phenomenon of the poor peasant families in the hills outside the city would go into the city, work for some number of years, if in this kind of domestic capacity, to acquire a dowry, which they needed in order to get married. But there was also a fund in Bologna for dowries, to provide dowries for poor, deserving Christian girls. And it turned out that the person in charge of that fund and determining who got it was the Inquisitor of Bologna. So here was a young woman who, it turns out, would have a relationship with Austrian soldiers and get pregnant a couple of times while she's serving, and have to abandon the babies at the local foundling home, who might not have been seen to be tremendously deserving from a traditional point of view, now could go and tell the story of how she had performed this mitzvah, although I don't think that's the term they used, of baptizing this child in danger of death, and therefore make some claim. So, plus it was only reported years later. So it might have happened, it probably happened, but, well, the other thing to be said is at the trial of the Inquisitor, she testified, how did she know how to go about doing this? And she said she asked a local merchant at a store what to do and how to do it. And he was then called in to testify and said that conversation never happened. I never told her that. She never brought that up. So there's a little question there.
Yeah. Just as a side follow-up, somebody asked, who was the Inquisitor in Bologna at that time?
Well, the Inquisitor's name was Felletti, Father Felletti. So the Inquisitors in general were Dominican monks, and that was the case in Bologna. If anybody, probably some of the folks who are part of our webinar have been to Bologna, and the Dominican church there is where he was, still looks the same, or largely the same as it did back then. And so he was then arrested, and he spent a few months in prison in Bologna before he would be released.
And then, so as far as how many people, how many Jews were there in Bologna in Italy at that time? And did a community survive World War II till today? And if so, are the relatives of the family?
Yes. Well, yeah, there were about 200 Jews, just 200 Jews in Bologna. One thing that should be said is back in the 16th century, when they ghettoized the Jews in the Papal States, the popes also kicked the Jews out of everywhere but a handful of places where the ghettos were allowed to exist, and Bologna was not among them. So after 1593, there weren't supposed to be any Jews in Bologna. It was only after Napoleon, briefly took over that part of Italy, or most of Italy, that the Jews were briefly freed to go where they wanted, and a certain number began to go to Bologna. Then when Napoleon was defeated, 1814, the Jews were sort of tolerated, but theoretically they shouldn't be there. They weren't allowed to have synagogues or kind of call attention to themselves, but there were a couple of hundred there at the time. The biggest community in the Papal States certainly was in Rome, where there were maybe 4,000, something like that at the time. In terms of after the Holocaust, the Jewish community in Italy in recent time, in modern times, had never been that large. In fact, at the time of World War II, if you think of relative size of Jewish populations, in Poland was about 10% Jewish. So there are about, I think, 3.3 million Jews in Poland. Germany was 1% Jewish. Italy was just 1/10 of 1%, something like 40,000 roughly Jews were in Italy. What was a result of the several thousand were died in the Holocaust, were taken off to death camps and murdered. Quite a lot went to Israel. So that the Jewish population today in Italy is probably something like 35,000. It's more or less the same size, but a third of the population are not Italian Jews. They're relatively recent immigrants of Jews from North Africa and from Iran, for example. So the Holocaust, although it's sometimes said that not as large a percentage of the population, Jewish population, Italy was murdered in the Holocaust as many other countries in Europe, still it had as you can imagine, a devastating effect.
And then just as one of the follow-up, is any of the family still alive?
Oh, yes, the family. Yes, in fact, I'm in close touch with some of the family, among whom there's Elena Mortara is a recently retired professor of literature at University of Rome, and she's kind of been the spokesperson for the family descendants in this case. So, for example, in the year 2000, when Pope John Paul II, as part of the second millennium ceremonies, decided to create a saint of Pius IX, she led the kind of charge for the Jewish community against it, although it's unsuccessful. So he was beatified in 2000. And they remain close to and interested in this case. She wrote a book not that long ago talking about since she's a literature specialist, a French, a particularly interesting case of a French dramaturg or playwright who wrote a play based on the Mortara case in the 19th century.
Thank you. Moving forward in time to your recent trip to the archives, what was your reaction to being in the Vatican archives physically? Were you aware of portions that were still sealed or inaccessible to scholars? And do you have there's one final point here. Do you have a sense of Pope Francis's perspective on opening them up more?
Well, theoretically, they're all opened, although that said, or at least theoretically they're not closed because of content. There's still some pieces that need to be fully cataloged, and because the archives do you no good unless the material is inventoried and cataloged. They could say, you know, everything's open. Here are 20 million uncatalogued pages. Go to it. And it wouldn't do you any good. And I have met recently with the heads of the various archives and talked about this question. One thing I found out, actually, the last time they opened archives, which was for Pius XI, my book, The Pope and Mussolini, was about, which came out a few years ago, was about Pope Pius XI was Pope in the 20s and 30s and his relationship with the Italian fascist regime. And that came about when they opened those archives. I met with the head of the archive, who was the same head of the Vatican Apostolic Archives. I said, are you making everything available? And his answer at the time was, yes, anything that could possibly be of interest to historians. The only thing we don't are sensitive personnel files. And at the time, I didn't give that too much thought, but then subsequent years with the pederasty, sex scandals, the church, I realized, gee, no historian ever working in the Vatican archives ever wrote about that. And the reason is none of those files were available. But of course, this is one of the things scholars are often kind of chatting about or speculating about. Are there some sensitive materials that aren't being made available? That said, as the material I recently published in The Atlantic shows, that may be the case, but there's certainly the Vatican, I think, is to be given a lot of credit for the fact that they are making as much available as they have been. Is there some other question I missed there?
I think you hit the main points there.
Oh, good.
Yeah. There's several questions here also about the potential movie and the movie release. And so one is more about what do you think the Vatican's reaction will be? And another one, just more generally, is if you have anything else to add about the movie. I'll leave it to you.
Well, in terms of Vatican reaction, I think this does worry filmmakers. And it's curious that First Things piece, for example, one of his rationales for the importance of the book, and Massori's book, and his article, The First Things Defending Pius IX, was that word is that Spielberg is going to be making this film, and undoubtedly it would be, he didn't quite put it in this terms, but Spielberg is a Jewish director based on a book by this Jewish historian, and screenplay by the Jewish playwright Tony Kushner. This is obviously going to be some sort of misrepresentation of history and anti-church, anti-papal screed. So there are, and if you go online, of course, you can see all sorts of vilifications of those of us who were, working on these kinds of sensitive topics and going outside more official narrative church lines. In terms of the film, 4 years ago, well, everything was all set up to start filming. The art director for Spielberg had spent 3 months in Italy getting everything set up. The 35 main actors were all set. Screenplays. Tony Kushner wrote a fantastic screenplay. And Spielberg held auditions for the child actor who played the 6 or 7-year-old Edgaro Mortara. And amazingly, they did open auditions for 4,000 7-year-old children on 4 continents. And at the end of which, Spielberg got in touch with Tony and me and said, I'm not happy with any of them. And that was on a Friday. And on the following Monday, this 3 or 4 years ago, he announced the film, The Post, about the Pentagon Papers he was going to make instead. So I was obviously very disappointed. And Mark Rylance is a fantastic actor, was all set to play Pius IX, and I talked to him, and he was excited about it. So it's I'm learning about, what do I know about Hollywood, this kind of thing. I've kind of been learning about the stop and go process there. So I'm still in close touch. I just talked with Tony about it a day or two ago. And the project is still alive, but exactly when it sees the light today, as my wife tells me, I shouldn't be holding my breath, but I'm hoping to see it someday.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I just, we have a few minutes left. I just want to return to George and to you, David. If there's any kind of final thoughts that you want to, or a question you want to ask George, just to.
Well, I actually, if there's a few minutes, I had one question I did not ask, and it's more of an inside baseball kind of a question having to do with your role as a historian. When you wrote The Kidnapping of Edgaro Mortara, one of the things that it was a story about small people. And you were part of a movement that said that history should not just be about famous people.
Yeah.
And yet, it seems like your last 4 books have been about famous people. And I was just curious about how you felt about this, this development. Was this just following the story where it led you?
Yes, well, it's an interesting question. So it's right. I had been involved in what was known as kind of social history movement. In fact, I was at one point president of something called the Social Science History Association, dedicated to exactly this kind of history, because most of the history has been written about, a tiny literary elite, even aside from kings and queens, until, recent century or so. 95% of the population was illiterate, so they weren't leaving letters and diaries and the other kinds of materials on which historians base their studies. But that said, so the Mortara story is probably where I kind of changed my tune. And the Mortara story is a little bit of a hybrid from that point of view, because you could think of it as a micro-history, which is part of this history of the smaller people and often based on court records for reasons I mentioned earlier. Yet, although part of them were the small people, the Mortaras, who were they? They were nobodies, historically speaking, otherwise. But also now all of a sudden you have the Pope and you have kings and all involved. So that maybe allowed my transition. So I would certainly put in a word for colleagues who are working on the history of 90% of humanity or 95% of humanity until very recent times. And it's also true that those of us who write for a broad audience, as I've been trying to do in my recent books, to interest a broader audience in this history, but are writing based on original archival material and have something new to hopefully tell our colleagues. But also we're basing part of our work on those more micro studies that are being done by other historians that aren't getting to have hundreds of thousands of people read their books, or perhaps even have these kinds of webinars very often with larger audiences. So I would certainly put in a plug for that, but it is true. My recent books and the current book I'm working on Pius XII and World War II is, I guess, are examples of the other kind of history.
Well, thank you, David. On behalf of myself and Matt and Becky and all the Haberman Institute and all the people online today, I'd like to thank you so much for really enlightening conversation, and good luck in the archives and on your forthcoming book and your forthcoming movie. So
Thank you.
thank you again.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure.